couple of questions here. And we're going to have a look at, first of all, how important do you think it is to harness your voice to influence investors? So I'm hoping, as if by magic, soon we'll get a Slido. You should be able to find it, and definitely those people that are online. So I'm going to ask you, how important is it that you feel that you need to harness your voice to influence investors? We certainly had lots of conversation around that today. Whilst we're doing that, I'm just going to introduce my panel. Thank you very much for coming along this afternoon, to Kunle, to Duncan and to Rhea. We're going to spend some time getting you to share your experiences, the things you've been involved in that are hopefully having impact on influencing this conversation. I think it was one of the challenges, actually, that Stephen set us right at the beginning of the day, which was to collaborate, not to say shift over and you're no longer in this space, but to come together and to work on this. And that's something that I definitely want to pull out of today.
Okay, thank you.
Here's our Slido. I have to turn around to see it. So, on a scale of 1 to 10, how important do you think your voice is heard? So we have got high distribution in the top. 67% say number 10. It's really important. So let's go to the next question, which is, how confident do you feel that your voice will be heard? And we'll see we get one. That will come up just shortly. Okay. So I'm going to just do a little bit of an introduction. So we've heard, actually, I don't need to do too much of this because you've already talked this morning about the challenges in terms of how underrepresented often that social enterprises and charities, diverse organisations are within the organisations who make the decisions. And I was particularly struck, those of you that know Social Enterprise UK will know that they ran the Adewale Commission on Social Investment earlier in the year, and that led to a report called Reclaiming the Future. And there's a social entrepreneur that inspires me daily. So her name is June O'Sullivan. She runs London Early Years Foundation, which is a range of nurseries across London, big organisation. And she certainly doesn't dress it up. That's what I like, plain speaking. And she said that the challenge was there were too many fancy pants bankers making decisions. I don't think she quite said it like this, but she did say too many fancy bankers making decisions about social enterprises and who should have investment when they had very little lived experience themselves. So we all know those statistics need to change. We know that the barriers need to be pulled down, and we know that the balance of power needs to be readdressed, because if all the people in the decision-making process is whether that's about the type of funding that comes forward, the products that are there, or who actually sits on the investment committees, those are all challenges that we need to face. So the idea is, in this session, we'll have some meaningful conversation about, where the situation is now, what needs to change, and how to ensure that your voice is heard. Did we get the Slido and I just missed it? Or don't worry, we'll come back to it. Okay, so let's start off. I also wanted to say as well, I have Lisa here, beamed in. This is truly working across all platforms. So Lisa is in East Lincolnshire or in Humberside?
East Yorkshire.
Yorkshire, see, I know. Right, that bit in the country that comes up. Wasn't quite sure where Lisa was today. And Lisa's going to be joining us and participating to the panel online. Lisa, you know me well enough to give me a nudge. I won't forget you, but do feel free to intervene and shout. And I'll also keep trying to turn around so I can get you, because I haven't got you on a forward-facing scroll.
No worries.
Okay, so, Rhea, let's start with you, okay? So the question is really, how have... in your experience, and you can explain who you are and what you do, but how have you looked to harness your voice to influence investors? Because you work in the investment space. And I think there's some of the learning from those surveys I talked about that have informed what you're doing now.
Yeah, of course. So can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, the microphone's working, cool. I'm Rhea, and I'm a portfolio manager at UnLtd, which also means that I'm a portfolio manager on the Growth Impact Fund, which has been mentioned a bit before today, but I'm sure we'll be talking a lot more about that. going forwards. Just for a bit of context, as a portfolio manager, that means I work to support our investees at UnLtd, so those who've received investment from us before, as we do alongside investment support to achieve their growth goals at the point of investment. But then for the Growth Impact Fund, we'll be doing that, but also pre-investment support. So that capacity building that's been mentioned quite a bit this morning, we'll probably touch a bit more on that as well. And how have I used my voice to influence investors? I guess there's a personal one, which is I joined the social investment space. I joined UnLtd because when I saw kind of the scale of the inequality and the way that funding flows for within the third sector and who that reaches and who that doesn't, I really needed to be part of actions that countered that. And I saw that UnLtd and the Growth Impact Fund was really working towards that. So by actually joining the team and spending my day-to-day working on that is a huge sort of part of my own influence in that way. But then, as I've mentioned quite a bit already, the Growth Impact Fund, we sort of make sure that there are feedback loops, that there are ways that we build in social entrepreneurs into our fund, which Duncan has been part of as the Shift team in our partnership to continuously learn from social entrepreneurs and with social entrepreneurs, as well as Big Issue Invest who've been involved in the fund as well.
Lovely.
So I'll keep it short, sorry.
Lovely, thank you. Because I'm going to move straight on to Duncan. And so you came over the fence, much like I did, from social enterprise, and to see how you can actually use your voice directly. Duncan, what about research and what about all the statistics that we read all of the time?
Yeah, so I think, hello everyone, I'm Duncan, and thanks for everyone so far sharing your voices, because that's part of this whole gig and what we'll talk about today. As a researcher, my job is not to talk about my voice at all, actually, and in some ways I shouldn't be on the stage, but my job is to really try and amplify the voices of others, and to use research actually as a tool. It's a really powerful tool to try and, really tell the truth, what's going on here, and to influence people to say, hey, the evidence is here, let's make a change, and let's understand what type of change needs to be made. I just want to start with, a lot of people have talked about barriers today, but what we haven't talked about is that the fact that those barriers are experienced differently for different types of people. And what I mean by that is some people experience those barriers more. And we should just be really careful when we're using the language like barriers, that we need to be really acknowledge our own positionality in this whole world. My privilege, for example, when we're talking about barriers, because some of you will find it easier than others to access funding. And I just think it's really important to start out with that. And a lot of the research we do is trying to understand, how do people experience these things differently? So how do can we adapt and tailor social investment to make sure it does work for all and not just for some? So that's really the core of why we do what we do. Lovely,
thank you very much. So that moves really nicely into Kunle. This is where you work. This is where Voice for Change works.
Good afternoon, everyone. I suppose my journey into this space was really forged, interesting enough, by a piece of research. We did some work for the Berrien Foundation around about 2015, and we posed the question for, I suppose, the charity sector generally, in relation to how did you experience grant funding, and are there alternatives that you wish to look at in terms of the type of things that you want to do, particularly in the enterprise space? And what came back from the research, we talked to over 100 organizations, was that they wanted to consider alternative income streams. We looked at the data, and we found that incrementally grants were actually going down for organizations, and the number of contracts were actually expanding. And what came back in terms of the recommendations of the research was that we want you, Voice for Change England, that's my organization, to look at the social investment space more seriously as an alternative. And so we began, all those years ago, to look at this. And I have to say, I've got to give props to the Connect Fund, because they were one of the first backers of the type of work that we wanted to do. We did a project called Shifting Gears, which was looking at how social investment could be used to scale up organizations. And we then hit, I suppose, a bit of a barrier, which was that whilst there was a lot of talk about diversity, in investment and about the need to bring left behind communities through, actual investment was slow to come by. And I think the sector generally, I'll have to be honest, did not actually engage to the level of expectation, particularly of social entrepreneurs, in terms of what they wanted. And in many respects, I think what we were experiencing was that it wasn't just simply about money, it was about also the design of the actual products that were on offer. How could they be made attractive enough to our communities? Yeah. And so for us, it wasn't just simply a question of making a lot of noise and hollering at people. We decided to look at, well, what if we began to develop a fund that was led by Black people and minoritized communities? What would happen if we began to then use those funds to target the kind of scaling up that we wanted to do? And as a result of that, we began to design a project called Pathway, which I think Stephen did mentioned earlier today. And that program now is about to launch on the 22nd of September. So we've gone from a conception of what the problem is to now we're actually actively engaging ourselves as an infrastructure body in trying to resolve that.
Okay, fantastic. So we've got investor, we've got research and data to support we've got infrastructure ecosystem, okay? And I'm going to go to Lisa. Okay, so Lisa, your frontline organisation, do you want to introduce yourself, and then you've got a couple of different ways that you've used your voice. In fact, it's well known, I go around the country and people say, oh, I heard this lady speak, and then I usually work out it's Lisa. So go on, Lisa, you do your introduction.
Yes, apologies for being ubiquitous. I'm Lisa Hilder. I'm a trustee for a number of charities in Hull that provide safe accommodation for women and children fleeing violence and abuse. And about 10 years ago, we started to think about scaling up and how we might do that. And I became interested in social investment as a potential for that. I started to attend a number of events, networking events such as these, where social investors were pitching up and explaining their offerings and what they could do for social enterprises and charities. And I very quickly noticed that the same organisations came to all of these events, and they were literally roaming the countryside looking for organisations in which to invest, and becoming quite frustrated because there weren't organisations clamouring to be investees with them. And what they were offering at that time was only partially interesting to us in terms of what we wanted to do. So over the course of these various events and conversations and networking, I started to develop contacts and relationships, and began to get into a more in-depth conversation with social and sustainable capital in particular about what would be helpful to us to scale up and how that might be done. And very long story short, the social investment fund manager, i.e. SASC, listened to what our needs were in order to be able to produce a product that would meet our needs. And we worked through that product. We piloted it, and the evolution of that loan product is the Social and Sustainable Housing Fund. So it was about very much being clear about why what was on offer wasn't actually suitable for us and what we needed to do, and also being articulate about what would work and how it would work, and actually not being frightened to be really clear and honest and say that won't work for us, but this might. And to find a partner in SASC that was willing to listen. So I guess the first thing is about explaining what was required and being able to work through in partnership to come to an arrangement and a product that benefited not only us, but then subsequent organisations. And I guess, you know, it's about not being afraid to be a little bit gobby. So that was one way in terms of using voice to influence. And then having been drawn into the social investment world, I became aware that there was an opportunity to sit on an investment committee at Big Society Capital, and thought, well, perhaps I can repeat the experience and the exercise that I've had with SASC and use my voice and experience to bring the frontline relevance of social investment to bear in the decision-making process. So really to help those around the table to understand, what does it mean on the ground? How can we utilise funds that are available to create loan products or social investment products that are very relevant for social enterprises and charities who are actually doing the hard graft at the coal face. And I thought, well, essentially, you've got to be in it to win it. Why not put myself forward? They can only say no. And actually, they didn't say no. And I am on the investment committee, and I'm not afraid to be a little bit gobby on that committee, to hopefully the benefit of others who want to access social investment.
Thank you, Lisa. Actually, that takes me really nicely. I've had a question here, which I'm going to ask everybody. So it said, what are the obstacles that organised face when accessing support? You've sort of covered this a little bit. And what positive things have the panel seen that have made it easier to apply for help? So I think I'm taking Lisa's as don't be afraid to be a little bit gobby, which is basically you don't have to challenge. You don't have to just accept what is being offered. Have you got any sort of reflection on that you'd share in terms of... what might make it easier to actually make that application? Because, Duncan, you were talking about the barriers and them not being the same. So it might be just useful, I don't know whether I know these stats off by heart, but, any of these stats that you can put that into example. I have a next question around disability, which is going to be a real key one.
Yeah, so I mean, the stats are really telling. I'm off by hand, but I think, there's something like only 2% of black-led businesses receive VC funding. I think it's even less actually than that. 15% of women-led or at least co-founded women-led businesses ever receive investment. I think it's even less if you're a sole women founder. Some of these things are really dramatic, and they're not just social investment, they're wider. And I think social investors always say, yeah, but we're different. But I think you are actually part of an investment community, and you need to own that, and you need to be part of that.
Absolutely.
Despite all the positive things that have been said about social investors today, there's a really important structural, wider investment part that needs to be part of that conversation. So what are some of those barriers? And then I'll talk about the corollary to that. So some of those barriers might be, and Kevin touched on it, especially in the investment process, but most of these organizations aren't even being contacted.
Yeah.
Most of these investors don't even know where they are. They don't even have the networks and relationships because, lo and behold, their networks and relationships look like them. And that's no, reflection, but that is the reality. So these organizations, diverse-led organizations, whether they're black-led, whether they're gender-led, like whatever we're talking about here across a range of intersections, and intersectionality matters here. Like really what we need to dig into is gender, race, and class. And to a lesser extent, but also importantly, is about disability, well, not lesser extent, as important, but disability and sexual orientation as well, but like bringing the intersection of that. How do we understand this in terms of privilege? And I think the barriers are, okay, first, how do you even have a conversation? How do you even ask, and someone mentioned about the silly questions, there are very limited spaces unless you have a mentor, an advisor that everyone's been telling everyone to have. How do you even get one of those? But firstly, how do you ask those silly questions? What kind of questions do you even need to know to ask? And how do you create a safe, inclusive space that's appropriate to you, that you want to be in? That's what's most important. And I think for me, those spaces are bereft in this space, and I think that's the first gig. And then the second process is actually the investment process itself, which is very difficult, upfront application processes that ask you for all this documentation and detail that you may or may not have, or you have it in draft form, or you're like, oh, I don't know if I want to show that to people yet. It's all those things, and those are very real and very human, but it's very hard when that's just press submit, and then it goes into a machine, and then you say, oh, I hope that was all right. And, it's those types of things that we don't realize. And then there's some very real structural barriers that exist as well. So a lot of people have talked about capacity. It matters actually backfilling people's time, like you mentioned, Lizzie. Just pay for this time to actually apply, and knowing that lots of people don't have savings that they can fall back on, or a part-time gig that they can co-fund, continue to bootstrap their organisation. That's the real reality of what we're talking about here. And that's why it is bigger than just social investment. That's why it's it's talking about structural inequalities that we have across society.
So, Kunle, do you want to respond to that in terms of, so you've talked about, therefore, it's almost like your community, and, I've said to you, like, we need your help, we need to get involved. And as a result of that, you're looking to create something that might address some of these issues?
Yeah, I mean, let's be clear. We are talking about business, and we are talking about risk.
Absolutely.
And to that extent, the racial overlay of that is that certain communities are seen as more risky than others. So how do we mediate that relationship? The question of, finance and the historical legacies of underfunding of those communities, the lack of opportunities from commercial banks to venture capitalists is there to be seen. So I think that what we have is, a sector that's got a turnover of billions of pounds that actually, if we're honest, is still relatively unknown to most of the populace. And so that has to change. Yeah. Access needs to be about putting together, I suppose, products that can be attractive to those communities that are trying to build businesses. But also, in looking at those social objectives in terms of the social space, ensuring that the evaluation and measures that we use to determine success are consistent, and so that we're not looking at the organizations in the same space in different ways simply because they come from different communities. The objective, I think, of opening up that space is, unfortunately, I think somebody said it in the last session, has been that, a black man has been killed in America, and that has accelerated, the openness of institutions to be able to engage in this, which is why I said earlier, for me, the issue of timing and the length of time it's taken to get to this point is a really, really important thing. And I think that the social investment sector needs to accelerate its kind of position, because otherwise I think the enthusiasm and the drive to make change will begin to wane.
Okay, I think that's really important. And there are a couple of things there which we're going to come and talk about. One is around the type of products that are available and how you respond. I'm going to hold that thought because we're going to come back to that. But I just want to pick up this point on risk, okay? Lisa, I'm going to come to you because we've talked a lot about risk in the room, but I think how we framed risk to date is the risk of the intermediary, the fund manager, making the investment, and Kunle's just given us that, some are perceived as being more risky. In fact, actually defining risk is a huge issue in itself. But can you reflect on that as somebody who sits on an investment committee? Declaring, I also sit on 2 investment committees, and as I told you I didn't know whether I told you at the beginning, but I'm not from a financial background. I sold ladies' clothes for 20 years, so hey. My route to being part of an investment committee has been quite a serendipitous one, and I don't think it should be left to that kind of chance. But, Lisa, if it's down to, when you have to evaluate decisions around, who should be supported for investment and who shouldn't. And in this case, it's a slightly different scenario because it is in a wholesaler. But if Pathway is a wholesaler, there'll be those same decisions at some point. Yeah, just reflect on that, because risk isn't just about the risk for the person you invest in. It's also the risk that the investor is able to take.
Absolutely. And I think what I've come to appreciate over my time on the investment committee is that clearly there's a lot of examination of figures and facts and the basic proposal, but actually the consideration of risk goes beyond that into a much more holistic framework, which includes interviews and sizing up, if you like, of the people in whom you are investing. So their skills, experience, track record, as much as, you know, what are the widgets that are going to be produced and where's the market and so on and so forth. So I think from the investor's perspective, it is much broader than the nuts and bolts and does it all add up to 10? And that's something that I was less appreciative of before I sat on an investment committee, and actually was quite reassuring in terms of investing in people in a very literal sense, as well as investing in a proposal or a product.
Very much, Lisa. Let's just come back to products, okay? So we've had lots of conversation with the audience who've talked about the sort of money that they need to make their organisations work. And, you know, I think over the last 7 years, I've, you know, come to understand that what everybody describes, what they need is more patient, more affordable, and more flexible capital over time. But I think what's happened, good or bad, I mean, you can look at this either way, is that what the market has done, the social investment space, has just taken what existed before, you know, so debt or equity, if you happen to have a governance structure. But all of a sudden, there's a real push here towards, well, what else could provide the kind of funding that is required? And so what I'm keen to just explore here is we can talk a little bit about what the Growth Impact Fund is hopefully aiming to do, and a little bit about, I don't know, the difference between how Pathway might see that money flow down the chain. But Rhea, do you want to take that up first?
Yeah, of course. So the Growth Impact Fund was announced in late May, and one of the big offerings we wanted to provide for social entrepreneurs was options, different bespoke types of finance, and especially when you talk about financial products, not just debt and equity, but also quasi-equity, which has been mentioned earlier today, and is also known as revenue participation agreement. So when I introduce that to people who haven't heard of it before, I like to send along a little sort of brief about it as well. And for those that haven't heard of it before, that looks like it's a loan, but your repayments are based on the revenue you generate over a pre-agreed period of time. So that could look like in year 1, you pay back 4% of your revenue. In year 2, it's 2%. In year 3, it's 3%. That's just random figures. But the point is that you pay that back over, it could be a quarterly basis. And that means if you have seasonal revenue, that pays attention to your cash flow. So if you make a lot of money over Christmas and then it troughs in summer, you pay back more during the first quarter and less during the second, etc. And sorry, I know I'm just going on to describe that product, but and what that means for the offering for our organisations is that when we first talk to them, they might be interested in debt. But when we explain what revenue participation agreements are and maybe how that could work for maybe an earlier stage organisation that doesn't have that traded history, or to be more adaptable for their future growth, that we can sort of develop that product based on their growth projections, their market, what they're seeing they might need to adapt to. And yeah, we've developed patient debt as well, which means that it can go up to sort of 8 years. And the hope is that with earlier stage equity and investing in a minimum of 50% diverse-led organisations, that we can support sort of more products like this in the market and show that there really is demand for that. And actually, on that note, we announced the fund, I said, at the end of May, and we expected a lot of sort of expressions of interest, but not on the scale that we've seen. We've seen almost 400 people already sort of showing interest in these types of financial products that previously there wasn't sort of the evidence perhaps for as seen by other investors, and as Shift's research sort of talked about, there was this latent demand in the UK, and we've really seen that over the first few months as well.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm just sort of conscious we've got about 10 minutes and I want to take some questions from the audience. But I'm just going to ask you, Kunle, because I've got 2 questions here from the live stream. And they're both about the sort of application process and the barriers that face. Some are around language, some are around disability. So actually, I'm quite interested, as working for somebody who's a wholesaler, what we can learn then from when Pathway, hopefully, is able to become this wholesaler. But what can we learn about how do we try to address these challenges where people are saying that actually the process you've got just doesn't work for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to talk to people directly in terms of demystifying some of this stuff. Certainly, when we started off with Pathway, we were thinking about a fund. We're now much more, I suppose, considered in our views, which is that we're talking about an ecology of enterprise development. So, I mean, what do you do with somebody who has never written a business plan before? Yeah. What do you do when you go to a community organization that has a turnover of under 100,000 a year, but is sitting on a capital asset worth £4 million? So the range of different kind of supports that's required really needs to be considered when we look at social investment within that ecology. And so for us, it's really about, I suppose, working through how, when we look at, say, wholesaler arrangements, what about organizations that want to start up their own investment funds? What about organizations that actually are looking to do development around buildings and acquiring capital assets? So I think we're now at a point where we think that a blended approach in terms of grants and in terms of repayable finance is the way to go. But alongside that, one of the really exciting developments is a discussion about, well, how do we develop a broader and more diverse range of fund managers themselves?
Yes.
What kind of training, what kind of help and support goes into creating those individuals?
Can I just touch on your point about accessibility?
Yes.
So just on that, I mean, the thing that, investors are investors and they're not typically accessibility experts. And I don't, please, if any investors in the room want to challenge me on that, please do. But I think, that's a really big thing in itself, right? Many organizations, like tech organizations, they spend years with 50 employees on the back end working through accessibility. So it's really challenging, but that doesn't mean it's so important. And so, for example, at the Growth Impact Fund, we're working on, is our website accessible? Do we go through the right auditing process? But it has to go way beyond that, because you have to be thinking, okay, if I'm having a conversation with someone with neurodiverse needs, how do I adapt this space? How do I adapt this conversation? And knowing that everyone's going to have slightly different needs. And you can't always expect someone to tell you, oh, this is my need. Actually, you need to start creating a proactive list and understanding yourself of, okay, we have the capacity, Rhea and I have put together loads of resources, and we're actually educating ourselves internally before we're in good shape to then say, okay, wait, we really understand now how we're going to adapt and tailor our investment process to everyone with slightly different needs and how we surface those needs in the first place. And it's hard and it takes time, but we're on the journey. And I think that it's just really important. And that's slightly different from all these other structural barriers we've talked about more specifically.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. Yeah, I'm with you. I'm up for being educated. I feel very fortunate to work with my team who, I don't always know the answers. I really don't. I'll be in a situation, I'll go, this is what I wanted to say, and I wanted to say this, but I wasn't sure how, wasn't sure what the right word was. I think having the confidence, if you're not in that space, to ask those questions and knowing somebody will walk you through it, because it's learning otherwise. Otherwise, I'm with Kunle. I get frustrated because there's not enough pace, there's not enough change, but I get frustrated about lots of things. Right. Do we have any questions from the audience? Yes, we've got 2 that I can see at the moment. Should we take both questions and then I'll direct them? So, yeah, if you want to go. 3 questions, I think. So we'll take all 3 questions in the go, and then I'll direct them. So, Dave.
Shall I go first? Okay.
Yes.
So we run a community of social entrepreneurs that makes all investment decisions by democratic vote of the whole community. And when we trust the whole community, they've always voted to fund women-led ventures. But we know traditionally women-led ventures only get 2% of traditional investment. So my question is, how can we set things up so that investment decisions are actually made by the communities that are actually affected?
Great question, Dave. We'll come back to that. Can we have the other questions in the room?
Thank you. I'm Bella Prasad. I run a company called Matching Mind, and I think we straddle the commercial and the social enterprise world, what we call tech for good. We're a technology firm. We use technology to match people for mental health care that's right for them. When we started, we got an Innovate grant. For that, we needed to be a limited company. But then for some other grants, it's only CICs. But we still do just the same thing. So we have a limited company and a CIC, but that's only because of the barriers for different grant funding. Is there something which you can do where the social purpose matters more than the...
So, sorry, just to clarify, is your question about how the structure of your organisation affects your investment opportunities?
The question, I guess, is one of the barriers is to get certain kinds of funding, you need to be a limited company, but to get other kinds of funding, you need to be a CIC. But what you're doing is exactly the same thing. It's just sort of this divide, and if there's anything you could do, perhaps, as investors to
right,
close
lovely.
that divide.
Okay, we'll take that question. I think we've got one more right over. One there, Grace, and there's one there as well. Yeah. We'll take the four, and then we'll do you want to go with yours?
Yeah.
And then
Daniel Morris. I'm from the Social Innovation Partnership. My question is around research. It's around voice. So I understand that research converts and translates into voice. However, my question is about how do you recognize and include those voices? So, for instance, you have a voice. So those that work in the social investment landscape, are your voices heard by those in the philanthropic landscape, for instance? And are our voices, people like us that are here today, are they heard by the investors? And if so, can we also hear from what types of voices from those investors are being heard as well? Because that would determine whether I go through the door or not. Because why would I go through the door if I know my voice is not going to be heard, for instance? So.
Great question, Daniel. And let's have the last question over there from Grace, and then we'll take those.
I wanted to ask, for those social investors that are in the room, what are they going to leave this conference / event as terms of one challenge to add?
Lovely, thank you, Grace.
In terms of the question is, what are they going to add to the challenge to improve what they've heard today and come back in 12 months' time in terms of what they've done?
Great question. Okay, let's take these in order. So I think the question around structure, we've had a little bit in some of the others, which is... it is a tough one. I'm just going to endeavour to try and answer this one if it's okay for everybody because of knowing the landscape. So, mainstream investment invests in SMEs, that's what they understand. VC invest in, again, SMEs because that's what they understand because there's equity. You then have social impact investment, which was set up essentially to try and support social enterprise and charities. I think the lines are blurring a lot more. There was some great research from SEUK a while back that said that, social purpose is the defining thing. And I think you'll find that there's a lot of the social investors that are listed in Good Finance's directory that will also invest in companies limited by share. However, I'm taking on board Patricia's point earlier, they are looking for some kind of reassurance in the Articles of Association. However, one of the streams of work we've got going on is around social impact venture work, so seeing if we can bring the venture space a little bit more into the social space. It is a challenge, particularly if we're chasing different pots of money, but I would say that there are quite a lot of social investors that do both, okay? So it doesn't answer everything, it is a bit of a challenge, but I'm just sort of conscious that came up previously. So if that's okay, I'm going to park that one and come to... Let's take Daniel's question first. Dave, I'm not ignoring you. I'm going to come back to you. So let's take Daniel's question first, because I think that leads on really nicely to Grace's about what we're going to do differently. So how is voice heard? I can definitely tell you how my voice is heard in my organisation. Oh, I managed to rope Lisa in as well, or at least how Lisa's voice is heard. But yeah, how is it heard in the Growth Impact Fund, and how is it going to be heard in Pathway?
Yeah, I think there are. It's a really good question. There are lots of different voices that come in at different points to developing a fund, to running a fund, and that can be, as has already been said, in investment committees. Ours at the Growth Impact Fund is all female at the moment, and in our fund, our advisory groups, those that were part of the research, and those that are continuously we're working with, so social enterprises that are going through the investment process right now will be checking in, will ask sort of how they've found it, but also will be open to feedback externally as well from those other investors, from social entrepreneurs that are looking at our fund and are curious about applying, but may not for whatever reason. But I think one thing that you said is sort of what voices are being heard in social investment. And I would say that to date, that hasn't been equal. It hasn't been everybody's voices that are being heard in social investment. But I think more and more investors are reflecting on their contribution and their part in bias funding, in who they have and haven't funded previously, and who they need to ensure is built into funds that are up and coming, which kind of leads on to you. And I would say don't shut the door before even approaching it. I think there are spaces where your voice can definitely be heard, whether that be in paid research for something that's coming up, whether that be joining an advisory committee, but also there are different levels of engagement, and it could just be for 5 minutes filling in a survey, or 5 minutes sharing an email, or it could be 5 hours being involved in like constructing and co-developing a future fund. And I think can speak to you after for more.
Lovely, thank you. And that's certainly the experience that Lisa had by going back and challenging and saying, what you're offering me is not what I need. That led to the development of a fund that then could be, I'm always very proud that it came out of East Yorkshire, came out of Hull, and just disproving for a change that social investment is too London-centric. So it was great to see that informed. Kunle, I'm going to let you have the last word on this. We do have lots of questions online. I'm not going to get to all of them within the time. So I'm going to let you have the last word on this particular piece about how are you going to build that in?
Well, I mean, it's a really good question, because in terms of Pathway's launch, in fact, our launch is going to be private. And right at the inception, we made a conscious decision that we needed to actually have those investors and foundations in the room if we were serious about what we wanted to do. And so we're exactly in tune with the question that's been asked, and that's the direction that we're going to go. So before we actually go and open it up publicly, it's to actually have that discussion with those investors. In terms of, could I just come back on the legal forms question? I do think that the space in the kind of non-profit sector is liberalizing in terms of the legal forms that will be accepted in terms of grant funding and investment. I know that it varies and it changes depending on which institution you're talking to, but even organizations like the lottery have started to actually give grants to organizations that are not registered charities. And so there is a shift. In terms of consistency, I think there's a debate to be had at the Association of Foundations, and I think that's where the discussion needs to rest.
Lovely, thank you very much. I'm conscious that we haven't asked Dave's question, and I'm also thinking that we've got some representative from Glass, I think, here, haven't we, from the Kindred Fund. So this idea about, and there's more and more of this grassroots about how could we bring in sort of more collegiate decision-making and around investing in a community and recycling that money. So I confidently expect that model to grow. I suppose the challenge there is it often needs a big slug of grant funding in the original sort of pilot phase. But I'm sure we will see more of that type of model. I'm from the West Midlands, and I know we're definitely talking about it.
Very, very briefly, just to say that, in reality, actually, that type of funding is just is alien to a traditional investor.
Yeah.
And it's so alien that participation scares the living daylights out of most traditional investors because of this idea of lived versus learned experience. And we can dig into that in a big way in another conversation if you'd like. But I think for me, the big thing that investors do is an implicit bias is you pattern match, right? You go, what's worked before, because that's the return and the risk profile that I'm used to. I'm going to invest in organizations that look like what I know or look like me. And that's just the reality of the investment sector today. And until we change the way we embed participation and who is the decision maker, we're going to see more of that. So I love what's happening in that space, but participation is far away from where we're at now, and there needs to be a spectrum, and we need to take investors on that journey. Some will be able to do some of the more radical models, and I love that that's created space, and we need to demonstrate that it works. And some will still be I'm kind of in this consultation process, move me along slowly, but I will reform, and some will be in the middle. But yeah, it's a work in progress.
Thank you very much. I'm just conscious I did really well keeping everyone else time, and I fell completely on my own session, so apologies for that. I just wanted to wrap up with a couple of reflections. I think I saw some badges. Is there anybody here from Caen?
My mid-50s, that's why I'm doing this project.
Yeah. So the whole idea for, I've told Charles this before, but the whole idea for addressing imbalance came when the team and I were sat in our respective homes during the pandemic, and I think we just got to the point of there was just another report that had come out, not one of yours, Duncan, of course, brilliant yours, but another report that come out and told us about this level of inequality, and I think we just got to the point where we said, we have to stop talking about this, we have to do something. And it was something that Charles said on a session he ran for me, where he said, I'm really fed up of people saying that my community is hard to reach. We're not hard to reach, you're just not having the right conversations in the right place. And so for us, addressing imbalance, whilst it be small, is just a way to start to have conversations with communities that aren't even part of that conversation at the beginning and should be. In terms of the other piece that I feel very passionate is around is the decision-making process. And again, we're working actively. Lisa's one of our supporters and sponsors for investment committees of the future, where we are absolutely, I will consider it as a personal measure of failure if we don't start to address the decision-making balance, so that lived experience as important as you say, that learned experience, and that you don't have, is not that you have nothing to add if you don't have a financial background, and we really are trying to seek to change the pattern. But I just thought I would leave you with three things, not least because one of the questions that was on the Slido was around are there any specific funders for people experiencing disability? Because actually, I don't know whether you are all aware of this, if you take SEUK State of the Sector survey, the two biggest barriers to diverse communities accessing investment are capacity and confidence, okay? The confidence to go and do what Lisa did, or do what Amani had done, or which some of the other organisations had done earlier. But even more shocking, because those are the two biggest barriers, is if you are an entrepreneur who is experiencing some level of disability, you're 44% less likely to be accepted for funding than another social entrepreneur. So I thought I would be brave, and I'm going to respond to Grace's question. And Peter Holbrook knows this, I know all the SEUK stats because I use them every day. But, you know, if in 12 months' time, or its 2-year cycle, we're still sitting here and we're still seeing these numbers, then we've all failed. And I'll be doing my level best to change up the conversation so that we can see a shift in those numbers. It won't be perfect, but at least we'll be making a move. Thank you. Could I just ask you to thank all my panel, and thank you, Lisa.